beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void.
And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. Male and female created he them. There were giants in the earth in those days, mighty men, men of renown, and they saw the daughters of men that they were fair and took them to wife.
These are rock drawings from one of the Tassili caves in the Sahara. Experts argue about the identity of these biblical giants, which it calls the sons of God, and it seems to strike a difference between them and the daughters of men as though they were different species. Whatever the truth of the matter, the Bible tells us that the earth became so corrupt, maybe because of the union of these giants and the daughters of men, that God said,
"The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them. I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee, Noah, I will establish my covenant." This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature which is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth.
One of the most startling telegrams to reach London from the Middle East read, "We have found the flood." Sir Leonard Woolley, famous for his archaeological discoveries while on a dig in the Persian Gulf area, found a 10-foot thick layer of water-laid clay with skeletons of small sea creatures embedded in it. Above and below this level of clay, he came across the remains of pottery from 2 different ages. This is the record of the flood, written in Akkadian cuneiform script, and it's almost identical with the biblical account. It seems it all happened about 4000 BC. 2,000 years passed, and the Neolithic period came and went, and great monuments to the ingenuity of man were constructed, and civilizations rose and fell in many parts of the world, some well known, some unknown and unrecorded. And our story returns to the place where the waters of the flood stood many feet above the rooftops of the town of Ur of the Chaldees, and to the house of a man called Abram. In the Hebrew, Avram. Abram, that's him on the left, with his father Terah, was a man of great strength and character, indeed a nobleman. God put it into his mind to leave Ur and trek north and westward across the desert to Haran in Syria. So quitting his very comfortable life in Ur, he took his wife and family and headed out into the unknown. But he took with him know-how and experience. And just as he had been a successful man in Ur, so he soon became a wealthy farmer and landowner in Syria. When Abram was 90 years old, the Lord God came and appeared before him and spoke with him, saying that he would change his name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of nations, and that he would be the progenitor of a family, a clan, a people, a nation, and eventually a company of nations, whose future role and destiny in the earth would ensure that total nuclear destruction of this planet, so universally accepted and feared by so many people, would not happen. For, said the Lord,
"As long as the sun, moon, and stars exist, so will the descendants of Abraham continue as a nation before me."
So this people, this nation, must exist somewhere on this earth, and that whoever and wherever these people are, as long as the stars exist, that people serve to guarantee the present and continual existence of the human race. Take heart. The creator of this limitless universe is to return with all his holy angels with him, not to a burnt-out and devastated planet, but to inaugurate 1,000 years of peace, freedom, and prosperity, freedom from the universal fear of nuclear obliteration. Abraham's wife, Sarah, is described in the scriptures as being a very beautiful woman. Indeed, she made quite a sensation when introduced into Pharaoh's court circles. Much later in life, when well past normal childbearing age, she was miraculously delivered of a boy child, whom they called Isaac, a name which means laughter, emphasizing the couple's happiness at the birth of a miracle son so late in life. Earlier, before the birth of Isaac, Sarah, who was then childless, had in desperation given the old patriarch Abraham her pretty Egyptian lady-in-waiting, Hagar, in the hope that she might have a child through her. Hagar did produce a son, Ishmael, claimed by the Arab nations to be their ancestor. A most tremendous test of Abraham's faith occurred when God instructed him to make a sacrifice of his only son, Isaac, an act brought to a sudden halt at the last minute by divine intervention. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham out of the heavens and said,
By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and the sand which is upon the seashore. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice.
Isaac, in turn, had a son called Jacob, who in his turn fathered a large family of 12 sons and 1 daughter. Surely she must have made her brothers fetch and carry for her. One of the sons, Joseph, eventually became first minister of Egypt in one of the most dramatic stories of the Bible. While in Egypt, Joseph produced 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were brought up within Pharaoh's court. These 2 are destined to play a most important part in the subsequent history of Israel. On his deathbed, the old patriarch Jacob commanded Joseph to bring his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to him for a final paternal blessing. The custom in those days was for the father to put his right hand on the head of the older son for the major blessing, in this case, Manasseh. But Jacob crossed his hands over and put his right hand on the head of the younger brother, Ephraim. When Joseph objected, Jacob, well aware of what he was doing, confirmed to Joseph that the younger boy, Ephraim, would inherit the birthright and become a great people and the founder of a nation and a company of nations, but that the older boy, Manasseh, would also become a rich and powerful people. Long years before, Jacob, on a journey from Beersheba to Haran, had a vision one night in a dream of a heavenly stairway leading to the stars. At the head of the stairway stood the Creator, and Jacob heard his voice saying, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. And thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Overawed by the mystery and magic of this vision, Jacob consecrated the block of stone which all that night had served as his pillow, and as was the custom in those days, poured oil over it, blessed it, and went his way. There are many today who believe that this very same block of stone rests beneath the coronation chair in the Abbey at Westminster, worthless in its intrinsic value, but priceless in its historic associations. Jacob's dream of the heavenly stairway was not the only strange event which happened to him, for there was another curious and never fully explained incident recorded in the book of Genesis, in which Jacob wrestled all night long with an angelic being. Now, whether this was a real event, an allegory, or a dream, we may never know, but it was at this time that Jacob's name was changed to Israel, a word which means a prince with God, or a ruler with God. Later, a series of devastating droughts in Palestine forced Israel and his family group to move south into Egypt, where they settled in the Ramesses area under the protection of Egypt's first minister, Joseph. Seldom has the phrase, "a friend at court," had greater significance. Joseph, when a young boy, was something of a visionary and a dreamer, and innocently, but perhaps rather unwisely, told his older brothers that he had had a dream in which he saw all his older brothers bowing down to him. In their understandable anger and jealousy, they later sold him to a group of Ishmaelites who were passing on their way to Egypt, thinking that this was the last they would ever see of their visionary brother. Later in life, Joseph was to be so honored for his special services to the reigning Pharaoh that he was made first minister. In this picture, he is presenting his aged father at court. As Joseph foresaw, his brothers did indeed bow down to him when they came down to Egypt to buy grain at the time of the famine. But their treachery in the past was forgiven, and Joseph made arrangements for the entire family to move down to Egypt to live permanently. On their arrival in Egypt, they were made very welcome by the local populace, who were pleased to see that these Semites had brought not only livestock on the hoof, but musical instruments as well. A musician is always welcome at the village festivities. The central man is not carrying a television set, but a primitive type of harp. Eventually, the old man Israel died, surrounded by his grieving sons. His body was embalmed in the Egyptian manner, and according to his last wishes, he was carried back up to Palestine and was there buried. Israel's clan remained in the Ramesses area, and during the ensuing 400 years, increased and multiplied at a rate which began to alarm those in authority in the Pharaoh's court circles. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. But there arose a new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, which is hardly surprising, as there was a period of about 400 years separating them. Don't be deceived by the calm and serene mask of Pharaoh Thutmose III, for this was the Pharaoh who, according to the Bible, inflicted greatly increased hardship on the Israel people working as slave labor.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians.
When Thutmose died after an exceptionally long reign of 54 years, Moses, Israel's unwilling champion, confronted his son Amenophis II with his demand that Israel should go free, which had little effect until the devastating series of plagues hit Egypt. And when the Lord's final affliction, the death of every firstborn in Egypt, occurred, including Pharaoh's own son, he finally agreed to be rid of the children of Israel forever. So in the year 1445 or thereabouts, Israel, now over 2 million strong, quit the Ramesses area and slowly head eastward toward the Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf, or Red Sea. The Egyptian army is close behind them, for Pharaoh had had yet another change of mind, unwilling as he was to see the end of his cheap labor force. The situation looks hopeless. Israel appears to be trapped. The marshes and the sea before them, and the Egyptians rapidly closing in behind them. And they said unto Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord. Even the Almighty appears to be caught up in the excitement of the moment, for he speaks sharply to Moses and says, Wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak to the children of Israel, that they go forward. It was as though he was saying, Get them moving. And all that night a bitter east wind from the desert blew and cleared away the waters. And when in the morning Israel looked toward the east, the sea had gone. It is not clear what it was that held the Egyptians back from making an immediate attack. Perhaps the fear of the strange phenomenon of the pillar of cloud, which acted as a kind of rear guard to Israel. But as soon as the vast column was safely across, the sea returned with terrible speed, and the Egyptian task force was wiped out. The Sinai area is not the sort of place any commander would bring even a trained army if he could avoid it, let alone a huge concourse of civilians used to the life in Egypt. Yet it was to this barren and sun-scorched wilderness that Moses brought the children of Israel after their miraculous escape from their oppressors. Although the people had seen with their own eyes the destruction of Pharaoh's hosts, it wasn't long before they started to complain. Would to God that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and did eat bread to the full. For you have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. However, despite Israel's continual complaints, enough water was provided even for all their livestock, and that must have meant a great deal of water. And regular, although somewhat dull, food was provided in the shape of manna, still one of the minor exports from this region. It has a taste rather like honey. This monotonous diet was occasionally relieved with game in the shape of flights of low-flying quail, which could be knocked down out of their flight path by an agile man wielding a stick. Moses was called up onto Mount Sinai to receive from the hands of God Israel's future charter, the Ten Commandments. But he was away from the people rather too long, and they were beginning to grow restive and querulous. They seemed to have a communal desire to worship something they could see. And so, and under great pressure, but unwillingly, Aaron, Moses' second in command, submitted to the will of the majority and had made a calf fashioned in gold, made from the thousands of gold ornaments donated by the people as a focal point for worship. But it was a bitter and vengeful Moses when eventually he returned from Mount Sinai to see what had happened, and he very soon re-established his authority, had the golden calf smashed from off its base, broken into pieces, ground into powder, and forced down the throats of the perpetrators and ringleaders of this evil deviation. Here in this desolate place was delivered to Moses Israel's divine charter of guidelines for the nation, a charter to serve as a basis for the people's destiny. Israel, observing God's laws and commandments, was to be a leading yet serving nation, carrying out God's plan for the earth in order to bring harmony, law, order, peace, and justice to all. Under God's guidance and Moses' leadership, statutes and judgments were later added, so that by the time the nation reached the land promised to them, they had a complete God-given constitution. So the children of Israel wandered in the desert, carrying with them Jacob's stone of Bethel, living the nomadic life for about 40 years, until all the old rebellious generation had died out, and only the young and strong, toughened by years in the open desert, were permitted to enter at last the land which had been promised to them. Under their new and skillful general, Joshua, Israel at last came down onto the Jordan Valley from the hills of Moab and crossed the river a little north of the city of Jericho. To commemorate this historic event, a stone circle was erected at their crossing place called Gilgal. The date was about 1405 BC. As long as Israel kept strictly to God's laws, the nation under Joshua's leadership was invincible, and city after city fell to them. The extraordinary story of the fall of the walls of Jericho has never been satisfactorily explained. Kathleen Kenyon, the archaeologist, found that the city had been burnt by a fierce fire and that much of the outer walls had fallen outwards down the slope, enabling the attackers to go straight in. The Bible record states, "And they went up every man straight before him, and they took the city." The land of Canaan, as it was then called, was divided up between all 12 clans, and they settled on both sides of the River Jordan. But not long after the initial successes, Israel, unused to the sophistication of the people of the coastlands with whom they came in contact, became fascinated with the sensual rites and ceremonies of their neighbors, and contrary to God's commandments, started intermarrying with these forbidden races. And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, Amorites, and Hittites, and they took their daughters to be their wives, and they gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served Baalim. Time and time again, the prophets of Israel warned the nation to return to God's laws, telling them in no uncertain terms of the dire consequences if they failed to respond. On occasions, they heeded these men of God, such as Elijah. But all too soon, they forgot their last act of repentance and sank back into idolatry. Seeing all their neighboring states with their earthly visible kings, Israel began to clamor for the same, and eventually their wish was granted. The prophet Samuel anointed Saul, Israel's first ruler. He was the people's choice. Although Saul proved to be a strong and determined leader, he failed Israel toward the end of his life. He was an unhappy man, and he and his armor-bearer died ingloriously after a battle. Saul was succeeded by David of the tribe of Judah, but David was God's choice. He could be described as a hero king, a mixture of Bonnie Finch Charlie, resistance leader, and commando captain. He was also a poet and a musician, and is credited with many of the Psalms of the Bible. David is often shown in pictures attacking the giant Goliath as a little shepherd boy, but in fact he must have been a muscular 6-footer, as he was able to wear King Saul's own armor, and Saul, quote, stood head and shoulders over the men of Israel, unquote. Thus they would surely not have loaded a tall man's armor onto a little boy. However, David found the armor too restricting and removed it, ensuring success in his encounter with a Philistine warrior. That a small stone could kill such a giant of a man has sometimes been questioned, but there is amazing power and accuracy in the sling, as demonstrated here in these 3 photographs of an Arab of the one-time Royal Air Force levies, who made a small stone depart from his sling with a crack like a rifle, shattering into powder on a rock 40 feet away. To further destroy the morale of the Philistines who had witnessed the demise of their champion, David removed Goliath's head with a giant's own sword. David was followed by the great Solomon, who desired wisdom above all else, and it was granted him. But he received not only wisdom, but such power and wealth that Israel soon became the most respected nation within the Fertile Crescent, which stretched from the River Nile to the Persian Gulf. Solomon's wise judgment between the 2 mothers will forever be remembered. So much international prestige had Israel at this time that foreign royalty from afar off, such as the Queen of Sheba, made the long land and sea journey from her capital at Sana'a in the Yemen to see for herself the wonders of Israel. Sadly, even before the death of Solomon, the nation was slipping back into its old idolatrous ways and even added civil war to its sins. Chapter after chapter in the Book of Kings records the phrase, And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. It was not long before the inevitable happened. The nation split into two warring factions, with the people of Judah and Benjamin staying loyal to Solomon's son Rehoboam, with their capital city of Jerusalem in the south, and northern Israel choosing an Ephraimite, Jeroboam, as their leader. They made their capital city, Samaria, on top of a fortified hill to the north, where now stand the ruins of a Greek temple at Sebastia. In spite of repeated warnings from Israel's prophets and men of God, Elijah was one of the few left. Israel became increasingly pagan, going their own way, every man doing as he wished, and a moral rot set in, corrupting this once great nation. In 745 BC, a soldier prince ascended the throne of Assyria and was crowned under the name Tukulti-Epilasharer. We know him from the Bible record as Tiglath-Pileser. In 732 BC, at the treacherous invitation of King Ahaz of Judah, Tiglath-Pileser attacked southwest through Syria and easily overran and conquered the most northerly groups of Israel and those living on the east side of the River Jordan. He deported the population en masse to the towns of Hala, Habor, and Hara in the River Gozan area. This policy of mass deportation was a frequent custom in those days and provided a constant source of slave labor. In 723 BC, the Assyrians again came down on northern Israel like a wolf on the fold, now finding this once tough people easy meat, and deported the remainder of the population, some again to Gozan, probably the area of the modern river Guzana, and others were taken further east into Media, modern Kurdistan. Quoting the Old Testament, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Hala and Habor by the rivers of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. This king of Assyria was Shalmaneser, who died in 722 BC, and this plaque in the British Museum sets out his conquests. We even have an illustration of some of Shalmaneser's captives carved onto his great obelisk in the British Museum, on which he has had inscribed, "The tribute of Yahweh of Beit Humri," that is, the tribute of Jehu of the house of Omri. Omri was one of the kings of northern Israel, and he is shown here kneeling in submission before the king and his courtiers. Over the past 150 years, many scholars have searched the scriptures and ancient records for clues as to what happened to lost Israel. And one such scholar was the late Edmund Filmer. After many years of intensive study and research amongst thousands of translations of Assyrian letters and documents in the British Library, he solved the mystery of what actually happened to dispersed Israel. As we have seen, he found that the Assyrians called Israel by this name Humri. Humri is derived from the name Omri, the king who founded northern Israel's capital city, Samaria. However, this name Humri soon vanishes from Assyrian records, but within 50 years of northern Israel's exile, in precisely the identical areas into which Israel had been placed, we have the first appearance of a people called Gimera in Assyrian records. This name Gimera, or Gamir, is evidently a corruption of the Assyrian word Kumri. In the year 707 BC, an Assyrian frontier post reported that the armed forces of Urartu were invading the area into which Israel had been placed 50 years previously. The Assyrian report stated, "When the king of Urartu, we know it as Ararat, came into the land of the Gimera, his army was routed." So here is displaced Israel, very much alive and well and repelling all comers, still acting as a cohesive whole and certainly not absorbed locally. While these smaller groups of Israel were having some local successes, things were not going at all well back in the west, for in 700 BC, Sennacherib was laying waste to the southern cities of Judah, attacking left, right, and center on his way back from his Egyptian campaign. These are just some of the prisoners taken at the siege and capture of the southern town of Lachish. It's a wall plaque from Sennacherib's palace, no doubt serving as a reminder to him of his successes and a boost to his vanity. His record states tersely, "As to Hezekiah of Judah, who did not submit to my yoke, himself like a caged bird I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city." Although approximately 5/6 of Israel was now far away beyond her ancient borders, 1/6 still remained in the south in its capital city of Jerusalem. These people, composed of the small tribe of Benjamin and the major one of Judah, remained for a century or so loyal to the worship of Jehovah, centered on Solomon's temple, where now stands the beautiful Dome of the Rock. Even though southern Israel had suffered yet another defeat and deportation by Sennacherib, the remainder appeared to have learned absolutely nothing from what had transpired and continued to ignore God's laws and the frequent warnings from Israel's prophets and men of God. Indeed, Israel was now getting a little tired of these constant tirades. Jeremiah, a great writer and a wise man of Israel, was filled with grief and foreboding as he learned of the nation's calamitous position and the moral breakdown of the people. He saw that the majority of the nation had now been deported to Assyria, and Judah, once a great and powerful entity in Israel, utterly unable to defend itself against aggressors. Now it would be logical to assume that southern Israel, that is, Judah and Benjamin, who must have been well aware of the disasters happening to northern Israel, would speedily mend their ways and return to the laws of God. But not a bit of it. Indeed, their idolatrous behavior became even worse than that of their northern compatriots. The Lord said also unto me in the days of Josiah the king, Hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel hath done? She is gone up upon every high mountain and under every green tree, and there hath played the harlot. And I said after she had done all these things, Turn thou unto me. But she returned not. And her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw when backsliding Israel had committed adultery, and I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, and went and played the harlot also. 135 years after the fall of Samaria, the defeat and deportation of the southern kingdom of Judah was completed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who had become the dominant military power after the decline of Assyria. This is Zedekiah, the last of Israel's rulers. The Babylonians totally destroyed Solomon's glorious temple in Jerusalem and carried away all the priceless treasures and artifacts to their own land. The small remnant of Judah and the surrounding population were force-marched hundreds of miles across the burning desert to Babylon as captives, where they remained for 70 years or so. Many of them found that they were enjoying this sweet life in Babylon and elected to stay there. But others, the patriots, pined for their own homeland. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. When Babylon in turn was captured by the Persians under Cyrus, he issued an edict, now in the British Museum, that those captives of Judah who wished to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple might now do so. Some 48,000 availed themselves of this kind offer, but the majority never returned. Those patriots who did return rebuilt the temple of Jehovah on the site of the present Dome of the Rock. This reconstruction was carried out under the command of Ezra and Nehemiah, whose nominal role of workers included none from northern Israel. The Jewish general and historian Josephus wrote in his book Antiquities in AD 70, "There are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the river Euphrates and are an immense multitude, not to be estimated by numbers." This statement confirms from a secular source the split in the kingdom of Israel and their deportation to Medo-Persia, east of the river Euphrates, a territory now known as Iran. 500 years after this Babylonian captivity, a young girl of the royal line of David was delivered of a boy child in a stable in Bethlehem. She called him Jesus. But to return to our detective story, the situation now is this. A small remnant of Israel called Jews, a shortening of the name Judah, remained in Palestine, but the vast majority of this once great and powerful people have vanished. However, we know exactly where we last saw Israel, that is the northern kingdom, in ancient Assyria and Media, northern Iraq and Kurdistan. This is fact, not guesswork. Both biblical and secular sources confirm it. Here are multitudes of people, displaced refugees, uprooted forcibly from their own land and herded away hundreds of miles into alien territory. Their surroundings change, they hear a different language, they appear to lose the art of writing, their very way of life changes and they're called by different names by their captors. Little wonder then that the rest of the rather uninterested world lose all track of them. It seems that the Creator's great plan for Israel, his chosen nation, has dissolved into thin air. But let us see what then transpired. In the reign of Sargon, an Assyrian intelligence report informed the king that these people called Gimera, which we now recognize as deported Israel, were located just west of the upper Euphrates, north of the Taurus Mountains, and some others were further to the east, in Media. The second book of Esdras in the Apocrypha tells us that some of the 10 tribes escaped from Assyrian control via the upper Euphrates Valley, and that later they became notorious in Asia Minor when they overthrew King Midas of Phrygia in 695 BC. These people were the western section of the Gimera, or Cimmerians, called Cimmerioi by the Greeks, another version of the Assyrian Khumri. In the second year of Esar-Haddon of Assyria, 679 BC, he defeated another section of the Gimera, forcing them westwards into Asia Minor, where they settled in the Sinope area on the Black Sea coast. They even got as far west as Sardis, which they captured in 662 BC. Urged on by the somewhat unfriendly Assyrians, many of Israel, now well on the move westwards, crossed the Black Sea and arrived in the Crimea, which name may come from the name Cimmerian. Others crossed to the European coastland between the rivers Danube and Dniester. Finally, a little after 600 BC, King Alyattes of Lydia drove Israel out of Asia Minor for good. Israel's movements, whether they liked it or not, were westwards, always westwards. Most of this western section of Israel migrated up the river valley of the Danube and settled as Celts in Central Europe between 600 and 100 BC. Others moved away north and west into the then thinly inhabited region of the Baltic, where they were called by yet another name by the Romans, Cimbri, a name also probably derived from the word Cimmerian. These people were the ancestors of the Jutes and the Picts. Small numbers of Israel followed the sea route from the port of Miletus in Asia Minor and sailed west through the Pillars of Hercules, that's the Straits of Gibraltar, and into Spain. Finally, they continued westward as far as Ireland, where they were referred to as Milesians, taking the name from their port of departure, Miletus. It seemed that an unseen force like the solar wind was always urging Israel north and westwards, following the setting sun. These Celts were a picturesque and warlike people, and although the less well-off wore only animal skins, the richer Celts loved brightly colored plaids and shawls, created elegant and artistic artifacts such as the Snettisham collarette. This superb shield dredged up from the River Thames at Battersea, and this curvilinear design on the back of a mirror found at Desborough in Northamptonshire. Ornaments and bracelets such as these, some would have us believe, were made by painted savages. The Celts were great respecters of animals, loved horses and dogs, and bred the latter for export to the continent. The Romans even sent Celtic craftsmen to Rome to teach their own artists the art of enameling. As the renowned archaeologist Dr. Ewan Mackey has written, "It looks as if our early Bronze Age society included an intellectual class with undreamed of capabilities in practical surveying, geometry and astronomy, and with the power and prestige to command large labor forces to erect thousands of heavy stones in the situations and formations they wanted, all over the British Isles." So now we see that the western group of Israel were forced right through Asia Minor into Central Europe and finally to the shores of the North Sea. The eastern group, however, were still being dominated by the Assyrian powers, such as they were. In addition to this, they were also threatened by not only Media, but Babylonia as well. The push is always from the southeast, forcing Israel northwest. In about 573 BC, and within 50 years of Israel going into exile, the Iskuza are mentioned for the first time in any historical document locating them in Media, the very place where Israel had been placed in captivity. Since the Iskuza and the Gimera both appeared in the same place and at the same time, it is reasonable to assume that they were one and the same people. The word Iskuza comes from one of the names that ancient Israel called themselves, House of Isaac. And as you might have guessed, the Greeks had a word for them. They called them Scuthi or Scythian. The Persian name for these Iskuza was Saka, also based on the name Isaac, in which the accent is on the final syllable, Isaac. Both names, Gimera and Saka, can be seen today on a rock carving in northern Iran at Behistun, on which there is a trilingual inscription in Old Persian, Susian, and Babylonian. In the Babylonian version, the word Saka is translated Gimera, thus proving that they were one and the same people. The basic root of the words Saka, Scuthi, Scythian, Iskuza, and Isaac is SK, which is also the root of the name by which Israel of old called themselves, Izakah, or House of Isaac. After the fall of the Assyrian capital Nineveh in 612 BC, and under constant and savage attacks from both the Medes and the Babylonians, the main body of these Scythian Israel peoples came under such pressure, especially from the Medes, that they were forced northward through the mountain barrier of the Caucasus, traversing the Darial Pass, and they occupied the steppe region of southern Russia, as it is today. As wave after wave of Scythian Israel was forced northwards, the leaders in the west crossed the rivers Don, Dnieper, and Dniester, and came into collision with the Cimmerian Israel group who had earlier crossed the Black Sea, thus forcing them westwards along the river valley of the Danube and into Central Europe. Although the Scythians had established themselves in southern Russia from the 6th to the 3rd centuries, they found themselves being squeezed between a people advancing from the east, the Sarmatians, and the Celts already occupying Central Europe to the west. Consequently, they had only one way to go, northwest towards the Baltic and the North Sea. This group formed the last of migrating Israel to arrive in these islands, the Anglo-Saxon group from the area now called Germany. They arrived between 460 and 600 AD. Others, after moving north through Jutland, became known as Danes and Vikings. Some of these came directly to England via the North Sea, and a reconstruction of a Viking ship has been placed on the cliff tops near Ramsgate, Kent. She was sailed over recently by a Danish crew on a rather more peaceful mission. Others settled for a time in France and were known as Northmen, or Normans, who, the last to arrive, came to these islands in the 11th century landing at Pevensey in Sussex. It was a regathering, according to Sir Arthur Keith, world-famous ethnologist, of one family, but with different names, not a racially mixed group, as is so frequently stated. In exile, the nation of Israel became divided into two separate groups, one in the area of the upper Euphrates, the other in Media. These two groups migrated by different routes and at different times to the British Isles, where they arrived one by one over a long period of time, finally fusing into one nation. In the audiovisual program, The Appointed Place Parts 1 and 2, we will show how this great migratory movement from the Middle East to the North Sea and the northwest of Europe was no chance affair, but was part of a divinely ordained plan with the Anglo-Celto-Saxon people, Old Testament Israel's lineal descendants, utterly unaware of their ancient history and identity, their destiny, and their future task they were to carry out from their new home in the Isles of the Sea, Ultima Thule.